Well, good morning, and thank you so much for joining me again this morning as I continue on my video series where um, I take basically I'm my whole purpose is to take the general principles, the deeper principles in Heilkunst medicine, and really start to unpack them and bring them out and show you how they apply to everyday life. So, in other words, to make them not just a really specialty item for Heilkunst practitioners, but really to demonstrate and give to you really really practical insights in how all the philosophy of Heilkunst will apply to making anyone's life enhanced, make it better, kind of bring out more, well, not just health, but really a greater understanding of who we are and how we go about our life and how we make sense of things. So the specific topic for today is on something called living thinking. And the we'll get into the details of all that, but just to tie it back in a little bit, um, I believe it was in our last video where we were talking about finding your calling. What's your calling in life, and how do you find what that is, and how do you activate that? And this is going to pick up on that theme in a slightly different direction. And we're going to go into this concept, as I say, of living thinking. And let me just bring up my screen here. I have a few notes I've scribbled down here. Let me put that onto the screen. Okay, so we have here my scribbly notes, but let me they're just more to remind me of my thought process here. Don't worry if you can't read my notes. That's not the important part. So yeah, as I'm saying, the main theme today is to take living thinking, the concept of living thinking, take it out of the science of Heilkunst, how we use it every day in the clinic in a very applied philosophical way, a practical way, and how do we bring this insight into just everyday living? Obviously, there's very few Heilkunstler, very few practitioners, but there are many, many people who can benefit from the philosophy. So let's take a little dive into it. So as I said already, in the previous video, we talked about the objective calling, or the calling rather, and how that's an objective part of who you are. We don't just subjectively on a whim make that up and think, oh, my calling is to be whatever, the next astronaut or the next great tennis star or something. Now, sometimes those things are coming from our objective desire, but often we get caught up more of the subjective aspect of kind of as I say, making something up. What's that expression? Make things up, make something up, and make it happen. Well, I appreciate that for its purpose, but for our purpose today, we want to get out of the subjective part of the calling, or really any part of our living thinking, and get into its objective part. So let me get a little more deeply into this. So what is etheric thinking? Is the other name for it, or the more common word I would use is what is living thinking. I think that's much more easy to relate to. And what we're going to see as we go through this, normally the way that we consider thinking, what is thinking, and what are we doing with it, we generally consider that to be a subjective activity. And of course, when it comes to science, like Heilkunst medicine, other forms of science, of course, we want objectivity. We don't want people just running around making things up and calling something this and calling something that just because we feel like making up a name for something. But we want kind of an objective understanding of our world and ourselves, and in the scientific context, in the medical context, and then even in our own life. As I say, when we come to even a topic such as finding our own calling, we want to be being able to identify that on an objective basis rather than subjective. And this is going to be the whole point we're going to come to when I ask this question: what is etheric thinking? Well, we're going to find that it's actually a very distinct method for tapping into that objective side of reality, and not just something that we pull up subjectively or on a whim, as it were. So I guess I've already made this point. It's the key to tapping into the objective side of thinking. And as I've mentioned, thinking is not subjective. And I'll just mention a point here. It'll probably take a whole separate video to really dive into it, but there's a really fundamental and interesting point here. And I took this point originally from Rudolf Steiner in his book, The Philosophy of Freedom. And he makes, in this, near the beginning of the book, he makes such a profound thought, or he presents a profound thought, which is a total twist or turning inside out of the usual way that we would go about considering what thinking is. And in this passage at the beginning, as I say, it's one of the most profound turns of thinking that I've ever come across. And he really points out that it's not that, like, normally we would say thinking is subjective, but what he kind of turns that all upside down, and he brings in a whole other way of considering that, or a whole other way of thinking or realization about thinking, that in fact it's not, let me put it this way, I'm kind of going to paraphrase him here. It's not that here, like a subject is me, I'm a subject, I'm having subjective experiences at the moment and subjective perceptions and so on. So in that sense, I'm a subject, I'm within my own subjectivity. And normally we would say that, myself or anyone as a subject is doing thinking, the subject is thinking, the subject is having thoughts, I am having thoughts, I as the subject, is having thoughts. But he turns that right upside down or inside out. And the first time I came across this, it was like, I'll never forget that sensation. It's like my whole world turned inside out at that point. And he comes instead at it from another point of view and says that it's not the subject who thinks, but it's the activity of thinking which creates the subject. And likewise, it's the activity of thinking which creates the object. So out of that primal function of thinking, out of that emerges these two subfunctions, which are subject and object, right? So thinking is this kind of primordial function, and out of it emerges the subject, and out of it emerges the object. So it's in our normal worldview, we look at the subject, as I said, here I am, a subject doing his subjective thing. And what that subject supposedly is doing is having some kind of relationship to the objective world out there. So you have a subject on the inside, and you have the objective world out there. It's like, okay, I say we're used to thinking that way. It seems so normal. It seems so obvious. But this is what Rudolf Steiner did. He turned that right inside out, and he realized, or he made us realize, that it's that primordial function of thinking which in fact creates that division in the world, creates the subject over here and the object over there. So I'll just leave that there. As I say, it'll be a whole video unto its own. Like, that topic goes so deep if you follow down that rabbit hole. But I just wanted to introduce it here because it helps orient what we're going to talk about with living thinking today. So the next point is, as I wrote here, thinking is the normally invisible part of our mental activity, but always at play. So what I mean by that, to call it normally invisible, let's start with an analogy. It's like, when you learn how to drive, at first, you have to really consciously learn every little thing. It's like, oh yeah, put your hand over here, and put this into this into this first gear, and put your foot over here on this pedal, and now put it over on this pedal. This is the brake, this is the gas. Like, you have to really consciously learn every single part of that. Like, you don't just get in the car on your first day and start to drive. Like, you have to learn all these components and like practice one little thing at a time. It's like, okay, now drive forward. Okay, now put your foot on the brake. Now do this, now do that. So we kind of have to, every step of the way, consciously learn all of that. But once we've got all of that, now we just, let's say you're, 10, 20, 30 years later, you've been driving for a long time now. Now you just get in the car, you start the car, and off you go. It's like, okay, I'm going to the store, I'm going to go here. We don't even really spend much, if any, time thinking about all the details of driving. We're just kind of thinking about how or where we want to go. Okay, let's go here now, and off we go. Unless something extraordinary happens, some near miss or near collision, somebody cuts us off, some really sudden dramatic moment, and then we go back into that mode of like, oh, gotta, grab the thing, hit on the brake, put on my signal, whatever. Like we kind of notice that, like those components, that we normally don't stop and think about. But as I say, that's a very exceptional state. But back to back out of the analogy, back into my main point here, the whole business of thinking, when I say it's normally invisible, it's like that. It's like when we're very well acquainted with how to drive, and we just know how to do it. It's the same thing with our thinking. It's that ever-present function or mental activity that's ever present. Here I am in the world, and I'm looking out the window, and I see a tree, and I'm doing this, and I'm noticing that. All of that is just happening, and I'm just noticing the tree and the cat and the chair, whatever the things that thinking is showing to me. But I'm not stopping to to really notice the thinking itself. I'm just noticing the objects of my thinking, right? Oh, as I say, there's the tree, there's the car, there's whatever. So that's the normal state. The thinking part kind of fades away, like into more of the invisible part of our mental activity, but we're just busy using our thinking to do whatever it needs to do at that moment. But what Rudolf Steiner points out is, if we, and actually we probably will do a series of videos specifically on that book, because it is such an amazing kind of turn of how we understand thinking, and how we kind of, you can get into a more what we're doing here, more of this living thinking, or more of this etheric thinking, as I'm calling it, or as he calls it in his book, The Philosophy of Freedom. This is what I have on my note here. He calls it the exceptional state, because, as I said in the previous note, our thinking is normally invisible, but when we start to raise ourselves up into etheric thinking or living thinking, we get into an exceptional state. So that this exceptional state is kind of, as I said in my example before, it's now when we are not only using our thinking as we do all the time, but we're actually making ourselves consciously aware of that thinking process as part of our whole part of our whole experience. So we're not just aware of the tree or the rock or the cat or whatever it is that our thinking is showing to us. But we're in fact simultaneously aware that the state of thinking itself is one of the objects that that we can be aware of amongst all the other objects. So not only are we aware of the tree, the dog, the cat, and whatever is around us that we are aware of, but at the same time, in the exceptional state, we can also be aware that the process of thinking is itself an object of our observation as well. So let me spell that out slightly further, where again, in the normal course of our mental life, our experiential life, we have two primary mental functions, and I wrote them down here: the observation and the thinking. Those two kind of play off of each other. Like, I keep using my example. I look out the window and I see the tree. We initially have just a pure observation. I open my eyes and there's a brown thing, a green thing, like a brown shape, a green shape. This whole kind of sensory experience. But that's the observation. It's just kind of a pure direct experience. But then the thinking steps in and it says to you, oh, that's a tree. It takes the observation and it adds a thought to it. It adds a concept, or some kind of thought form, which helps us to fully complete that experience of noticing the tree. It's like not just the raw experience, but now it's kind of a more delineated experience. We kind of can draw a conceptual line around that and say, oh, that's a tree. Okay, so as I say, just to point out here, we have observations, we have thinking, and between the two of them, we have this complete experience of reality. And to say this another way, the function of thinking, I kind of said this just a moment ago, but to say it in another way, the function of thinking joins together our perceptual activities with our conceptual activities. So, as I just said a moment ago, that's really what gives us a full experience of reality. We don't just have a one-sided perception or a one-sided conception, but through thinking, now we have the fullness of reality as it is meant to present itself to us. So to add another point to this, it's and you may have already deduced this from what I'm saying, but I'm just going to spell it out here. It's, at one level of our everyday experience, we have sense organs. We have our vision and our hearing and our smell. All of our senses, and those senses are really rendered into our experience through our sense organs. Our eyes is what helps transmit the visual impressions to our experience, and our ears, and everything in the ear brings in the auditory experience. So our sense organs are really are really what give us the ability to perceive all these sensory qualities. But at another level, back to the idea of thinking not being subjective, we could say also that our thinking organ is kind of the spiritual facility that we have for perceiving thoughts. So it's not that we generate thoughts. It's not like our brain is a little thought factory and it just keeps popping out one thought after another. It's that would be the idea where thinking is subjective, and as we know now, it's not. But rather what we have is we have a capacity or an organ, just like we have our sense organs to see perceptual qualities. We have our thinking organ or our thinking capacity, which through which we perceive thoughts. So in other words, thoughts, as I just said, aren't something that we create or manufacture, but they are something that we perceive. And in this sense, that's kind of takes us into what I said earlier. The objective nature of thoughts is that we perceive them as a certain, as you say, just like we perceive a certain sense quality, as kind of an object, a perceptual object in the world around us. Likewise, we perceive thoughts as something that is kind of in reality around us, but we have to perceive that as part of the counterpart to the perceptual side. So to go back to our main point here, so the whole idea of living thinking or etheric thinking. So if you put all of this together, everything I've said so far, we have now we come to this understanding that the totality of reality, the totality of our full experience, when we come into this living thinking, or what Rudolf Steiner called the exceptional state, now whatever those perceptual objects are around us, the tree, the dog, the car, all those examples I gave, those perceptual objects, as we're experiencing them, at the same time that that's this whole thing of perceiving thinking, we start to have this objective sense, or this sense of reality, that those thoughts, that thinking is at the same is existing, is at the same level of reality as the perceptual objects. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. We have our perceptual experience over here, we have our conceptual experience over there, and it's that function of thinking that brings all of that together as a total reality. So that's, as I say, that gives us normally, and let's even bring this back to medicine for a moment. When the whole science of medicine, especially in our contemporary context, what's very, very popular is what's called evidence-based medicine. That's just a form of empiricism, which the underlying philosophy of that, if you really tear it apart, what it's really saying, what it's really implying about reality, is that the experiences that come through our senses are supposed to be the most real things, and anything that comes through our thinking is kind of downgraded as something that's supposedly less real. Something that's subjective, something that we merely add on to reality. What's, as I say, what sensory reality is supposedly giving us the more real part of reality, and our thinking is giving us the less real. So anyways, to bring this more into the general point here, in the living thinking, we come to a very different understanding that our thoughts, our process of thinking, is actually as real as our as the perceptual part of reality, the shapes and the colors, all the things that come in through our sense organs. So this is where you come to as you start to understand and start to practice this function of living thinking. You start to see that exactly for what it is. That are, as I said, the sensory reality and our conceptual reality, as it comes, all of it comes through our thinking, is all joined together through our thinking, and that gives us like a total level playing field of reality of all these components, equally valid as the others. So it's, we don't say thinking is more real, we don't say sense reality is more real, we just say, yeah, all of them joined together gives us the total picture of reality. Now, one of the last points I want to make, I've kind of hinted at this, but earlier we were talking about, finding the objective sense of what is your calling in life. And likewise, not just for your calling, but we can use this form of living thinking, as I say here, as a kind of Heilkunst meditation, a living meditation. I know there's many forms of meditation, but I tend to be very, very partial to practicing this myself. Of course, I do it in the clinic when I'm with a patient and I'm applying this living thinking to their case and figuring out what's going on with them. But likewise, you don't have to be so specific and so scientific. You can take this living meditation, this living thinking as a form of meditation out into your everyday life. And it can really kind of bring much more reality into how you're understanding your life, yourself, what's going on around you. It just becomes, as I say, more of a kind of this objective way of relating to life. And normally we feel kind of trapped in our subjectivity, but we don't need that. We don't need to stay there. We don't need to stay trapped in subjectivity. We do have the key, through living thinking. It gives us this key to kind of finding those objective elements in life, and that becomes much more empowering and it gives you much more of a guidance system to make decisions and figure out what's what in your life, and where the meaning is, and why you're going this way in your life instead of that way, why your calling is taking you over there instead of over here. So it becomes, as I say, a very objective process, and it becomes a very different kind, but a very powerful kind of meditation for actually navigating into raising yourself up in your life, figuring out who you are, what you're meant to do, all those kinds of things. So as I say, this is just playing off of our last video, but we're going to go in a future video much more deeply into this and unpack the philosophy of all of this, so that we could bring even more kind of dynamic examples of how this applies to day-to-day life. So thank you for joining me for this brief video today. And as I always say, you can continue to see the future videos by tuning in wherever you saw this video today, whether that was on Facebook or YouTube or whatever the case is. And I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.